We ask, and indeed we insist, that our allies and partners do their part on defence.
I think that Australia should decide what we spend on Australia's defence. Simple as that.
He sort of held the door open for spending more money on defence. I don't think we're going to get to that 3.5% number.
That 3.5 number would take us to about $40 billion extra in defence spending a year. Hey, Josh.
Hi.
The Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, is preparing to head to Canada for the G7. There are expectations that he'll be meeting with the US President Donald Trump on the sidelines of that event. If the meeting goes ahead, Josh, the list of topics for discussion has just gotten longer, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think we got a number one new agenda item for that meeting. But yes, it'll be a long list of discussion items. The PM and Trump have spoken a few times before, but this will be their first in-person meeting. I think it would be a long list, and it's unclear exactly how long a meeting would go for, even if there was one. But I mean, Orcus would have to be the top of the agenda for the PM at this point, but there's also a number of other really critical issues. The obvious ones, the long-term ongoing ones around trade and tariffs. There are issues around Australia's stance on social media, the under 16 social media ban, the news media bargaining code, the news media incentive, which would make some of the big social media companies pay for Australian news, which is an initiative some of those companies who have the ear of Donald Trump absolutely hate that policy. There's some issues around film industry and food and beef and all these sort of things. There's a lot on the agenda if and when they get to meet.
The future of the more than $200 billion Aukus partnership appears to be in doubt. Josh, talk to me about what we know about the review that is now being conducted in the United States.
Yeah, it's been hard this morning to get a lot of detail about exactly what is going on here. All we know, a line from the Pentagon is, I'm quoting here, the department is reviewing Orcus as part of ensuring this initiative of the previous administration is aligned with President Trump's America First agenda. It talks about ensuring the highest readiness of American service members, about allies stepping up to do their part for defense, and that the American industrial base for defense is meeting their needs. So we don't have an exact idea of how long it will go for, how long it's already been going for potentially, if it's brand new or if it's been ongoing in the background for a while, what outcomes it might have, what are the terms of reference, all these sort of things. I think there are some questions about whether it is, as the government is trying to portray this morning, just a routine review, it's a new administration, they're having a look at a whole lot of different things, or whether this is a more targeted, more like the kind of review that you do if you were looking for an excuse to can something or change it or ask someone for more money.
Josh, you just mentioned that the government's looking to present this as a routine review. Publicly, the Albanese government is downplaying this. What has the Prime Minister and what have other senior ministers in his government said?
Yeah, I'll be really interested to see what the Prime Minister says about this when he does, when we do hear from him next. Richard Marles, the Defence Minister, has been the one sort of mostly out on this.
Can you guarantee that we'll get submarines out of this deal?
I'm very confident this is going to happen.
That, not unusual that this would happen.
The review that's been announced is not a surprise. We've been aware of this for some time. We welcome it. It's something which is perfectly natural for an incoming administration to do.
But at the same time, he's been to the US a number of times, met with his defence counterpart, Pete Hegseth. Albanese spoken to Trump about AUKUS a number of times. Penny Wong has met her counterpart in the Trump administration, the foreign minister, Secretary of State Marco Rubio. And more broadly as well, Kevin Rudd, the ambassador, the former prime minister, has been doing a mountain of work on this stuff, meeting with all these, US Congress people, senators and that sort of thing. There is a wide range of support in the American Congress for AUKUS, which is one of the points that both the Labor government but also the coalition opposition are pointing to today, of saying, this isn't just like something that Joe Biden cooked up on his own back in the day. This was, pretty decent support from a lot of people in the government, both over there and here as well. But at the same time, there are some concerns about America's industrial base, about how many submarines they can actually build, how many they've got, whether they can, in their view, whether they can afford to, sell Australia a couple of submarines, which is the first part of the plan before the submarines that will be built here. Obviously take a lot of time. We've got to build the shipyards to actually build the ships. There's a lot of time between now and then.
Josh, I wanted to ask you about some of the comments that others have made suggesting that this review has been triggered by the Albanese government's stance on defence spending. Others suggesting that even sanctions against Israel played a part in this. Are there any indications that either of those issues are connected to this review?
If I had to guess, I would think it's the first one more than the second one. As I mentioned, Richard Marles, the Defence Minister, has met with Pete Hegseth, the US Defence Secretary, a number of times, and there was big news about a week ago after their latest meeting, where Hegseth came out of the meeting with Marles and put out a statement saying that he'd urged Australia to boost its defence spending to 3.5% of our GDP.
We ask, and indeed we insist, that our allies and partners do their part on defence.
This is sort of pretty, complicated and mathematical figures and all this sort of thing. But essentially, Australia's defence spending is around 2 and a bit % of GDP. In the last election, people might remember the coalition had pledged to raise that to 3% of GDP. And Peter Hegseth is saying, well, Australia should. Well, at least he told Marles that America thinks that Australia should raise it to 3.5%. Marles and the Prime Minister, numerous times in the last week have said, well, we're going to make our own decision.
Well, I think that Australia should decide what we spend on Australia's defence. Simple as that.
We're not going to just pick some arbitrary number out of the air and say we're going to spend 3.5% of all the money that we make on defence, right? Because we don't do that for any other portfolio. We don't do that for health. We don't do it for social services. We don't do it for infrastructure or communications or anything like that. But I do think this point about the defence spending is important, because in the Pentagon statement that I read you a moment ago, they were saying part of the review was around whether allies step up fully to do their part for collective defence. So, I mean, in sort of diplomatic speak, that sort of says we want you to pull your weight a bit more, whether allies are doing that or not. Albanese at the press club, he gave a big speech at the National Press Club a few days ago, again said we're going to make our own decisions. Australia should make its own decisions about what Australia spends on defence, not another country. But he did hold open the prospect of potentially spending more. Right? He was saying if the government spends money on assets, we spend money on the things that we think are important for Australia's defence. And if someone comes to him with a paper or a proposal that says we need to buy XYZ thing, drones, more missiles, more defence for the northern bases of Australia's northern coast, whatever, that he would look at that. So I think he sort of held the door open for spending more money on defence. I don't think we're going to get to that 3.5% number, but I think that will be potentially where some of these discussions do end up.
That 3.5 number would take us to about $40 billion extra in defence spending a year, which is, an extraordinary amount
of money.
Yeah, Josh, I thought it was interesting that the former ambassador to the US, Joe Hockey, said that he believes the disagreement over defence spending was the likely catalyst for this review. I want to ask you about Scott Morrison's comments. Of course, Orcus was born under Scott Morrison's prime ministership, alongside that of Boris Johnson in the UK and Joe Biden. Some would recall that press conference back in 2021 during the COVID era, where the three of them appeared virtually to announce this partnership. What has Scott Morrison said about this review?
Scott Morrison, as you say, one of the architects of the Aukus solution, the Aukus Pact. It's been really interesting. There's been a lot of people who were really interested in what he would say about this. Obviously, a former coalition prime minister, but obviously has an interest, legacy-wise and otherwise, to see Aukus continue. He said that we shouldn't overinterpret what this review means, what it's about. He was saying that it was a departmental review. It wasn't a policy decision at this stage. That, other countries, as we've talked about, are doing similar reviews of their own. But at the same time, Morrison, who had a pretty decent relationship with Trump by all accounts, said that Australia still needs to make the case for Orcus. So I think that's sort of saying, well, when Trump and Albanese eventually meet, whether it's this weekend or this week or at some point in the future, but also, when Miles meets his counterpart or Penny Wong meets her counterpart, they need to keep sort of maybe reminding the US that this is a pretty good deal for the US too, where there are benefits for the US out of this. It's not like the US is doing us this huge favour. I mean, they are doing us a favour. We're paying them very handsomely for it. So I think that's kind of what Morrison was kind of going to, of saying, we need to keep reminding the US that this is a good deal for everyone.
As we're discussing the views of former Prime Ministers, the former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull holds a very different view to that of Scott Morrison. He's been a long-time critic of Aukus, which he says was born out of deceit. And we'd all recall the comments made by the French President Emmanuel Macron when the deal with the French was torn up. But he has been warning of the risks that Orcus poses to Australia's sovereignty and security, and again has weighed in now that there is this review on foot. What is he saying?
Yeah, Malcolm Turnbull, one of the people that journalists sort of look to in this sort of situation, because as you say, he's had some very interesting views on Orcus in the last little while. This morning, very early, he tweeted, the US is now doing its own review. The UK has one underfoot. Why hasn't Australia done one of our own?
Well, we need to wake up in Australia. I mean, frankly, there is a denial of reality.
The way he's spoken about this, previously, but also today, is sort of saying, well, there are these risks, probably exactly what happened and what's happening right now, that America is reviewing it. Potentially it's up on the table. Was a risk that was there from the start.
The transfer of the submarines is a decision of the US government. And if they do not stick to plan A, if they say, no, as we foreshadowed, we can't spare them, then we end up with no subs. So what are we going to do about it? So, basically, we have to get real.
Josh, we've seen now on a number of fronts a widening gap between the United States and its allies. We've seen it on issues around defence, as we're discussing now, Israel, trade, environmental issues. How high stakes is this meeting, if it goes ahead, between Anthony Albanese and Trump?
Yeah, I think Albanese has been asked this question a couple of times too, and other members of the government. I say every meeting between the US president and the Australian Prime Minister is high stakes. But as you mentioned there, there are obviously a lot of issues sort of all in the same sort of space, overlapping issues that are all happening all at once. It was interesting on the weekend, the Trade Minister, Don Farrell, in an interview, he was asked about, what's going to happen in this meeting, how are we going to get a good deal? And Farrell basically said, I'm not sure if he sort of, belled the cat on this, but he said basically it's up to Trump. Like, Trump makes these decisions. The final decision is up to him. So usually in these kind of meetings, right, there's all these things that go on back and forth between ambassadors and diplomats and bureaucrats and, people in the public service, and they talk to the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs, talks to the American, Department of State, and all these sort of things. But and I'm sure those things are going on at the moment still, but it seems more high stakes that you get a good conversation with Trump this time around, right? It is really important, and I think this is why some of the statements we heard from the coalition and other critics this morning are saying Albanese has to have number one, have the meeting, lock in the meeting, but number two, get a good outcome for it, because there are, as you say, Orcus, the trade deals, issues around social media, issues around the broader diplomatic and military relationship that might be in the crosshairs.
And how do you think Anthony Albanese will go about navigating that conversation based on how he has dealt with Donald Trump since he returned to the White House?
This is a really interesting question, and I think it's hard to tell at this point because they haven't actually met before. Like I said, they've had a couple of phone calls, and by all accounts, they've been pretty good phone calls, pretty warm and welcoming and all that sort of stuff. Even though, obviously, Albanese from the left and Donald Trump not from the left, there was a really interesting point, I think, after their first call maybe, where Trump said he got on really well with Albanese. What a great guy. He's a very good friend. And asked about it later again, I think after the election when Albanese had won, he said, Albanese, great guy, I know him really well.
I can only say that he's been very, very nice to me, very respectful to me.
It's unclear exactly how Albanese will go about it, but I think they're starting from a good point, probably. And I think if Albanese can kind of go, well, look at all the money we're sending you, the money we've already sent. We sent you 800 million Australian dollars a couple of months ago. We're helping you revitalise your shipyards and your defence industrial capability. We're going to use these submarines in our part of the world to kind of, help advance, the Western kind of interests. There are some, I think Joe Hockey's talking about bargaining chips, saying that Orcus was a pretty good bargaining chip for Albanese to kind of say, look, we're doing a lot. There's a lot on the table here that Australia is giving to America. Please uphold your end of this deal.
So, Josh, does the Australian government have a contingency if Orcus does collapse? We hear a lot about how important Orcus is, but is it considering a plan B?
Publicly, no, there's not. And Richard Marles, the Defence Minister, was asked about this. He was asked this exact same question on ABC Radio.
If it doesn't happen, what's the backup plan?
Well, I think, I often get asked this question. It's really important we stick to a plan.
The plan A is to stick with the Orcus submarines. He spoke about the coalition when they were in government, went back and forth between Japanese submarines and then French submarines, and they ended up with the Orcus deal after a lot of back and forth and a lot of money spent, a lot of time wasted.
Because if you chop and change every 3 years, you will never, in fact, build a submarine.
So you're saying we only need plan A. We don't need... You're saying plan B is a problem.
What I'm saying is that we will only acquire a future submarine capability if we stick to a plan.
It seems at this point, maybe there is a plan B that's in the background somewhere, but publicly at least, they're saying we're sticking to plan A.
I guess all depends on whether Donald Trump will also stick to plan A.
Or does plan XYZ, CBD, yeah, exactly.
Josh, thanks so much. We'll be speaking to Tom, who'll be travelling with the Prime Minister to the G7 in Canada next week. So we'll be keeping across all of the developments. Thanks so much.
Yeah, great. Thank you.